Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, and we welcome back to our study of international relations. So far we've been looking at what the international is. That's what we did in the first lecture, and we punctured holes into imagining our international to be something on the outside, and I invited you to look at our everyday worlds, everyday lives as part of the international. In the second lecture I took you through the various ways of looking at IR, where we've looked at its history from 1919 to 2019. So it's quite a coincidence that when we are looking at IR today, it's been a century of understanding IR, and in these 100 years, a lot has changed in both the object of study as well as the method of studying that, as well as the person who's studying it. From being a Western, male-centric academics, social science, it has come to be a heterogeneous and now has several plural voices which represents the diversity of this world. So in many ways the IR has changed dramatically for the better and has opened up and welcomed diverse voices, questioning, asking questions and suggestions, and pushing for a more representative discipline. Now in today's class we're going to look at a core theory of IR, and that is liberalism. And in the second lecture I ended by mentioning a scholar by the name of Francis Fukuyama, and we're going to start today's class by looking at him, and we'll look at this long journey that liberalism has made and the tremendous changes that this theory, this philosophy has made starting from Europe. But first, Fukuyama. Now, Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man, is a book which celebrates liberal democracy at the end of the Cold War and argues that there are no further challengers to liberal democracy after the end of communist Soviet Russia. Now that's an interesting argument, and it wouldn't make any sense without a little bit of a background to the book. The Cold War began at the end of the Second World War between Stalinist Russia and capitalist America. We know about the estrangement, the ideological opposition between the USSR and the US, and this tension, this division of this distribution of power is called bipolarity. When there are two superpowers and there is an active contest between them, which often spills over into contestations in a third territory, which is what we saw during the Cold War. Now the Cold War was also called a period of a long peace, which meant that even though there were conflicts being waged between the US and the USSR elsewhere, be it the war in Afghanistan or the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were never face to face in a battlefield the way things were in the First and the Second World War. So Fukuyama's argument is that the end of communist Russia is an end to the ideological opposition to liberalism, and that compels us to look at the extraordinary long journey that liberalism has made from the 16th century from Great Britain, and has literally transformed the world in every which way, including yours and mine, for the philosophy that it embodies. And we will look at that by starting off where the story begins in Great Britain, and we'll start by looking at the East India Company, because it is something that which is contextual to our location as a post-colonial state, as a former British colony, which India was, and it also allows us to look at the hierarchies of power and the power of philosophy. So liberalism starts in Great Britain with the theories of Ricardo and Adam Smith, and these theorists argued that at the center of the universe, it is not the state which is of importance, it is the individual. The individual's freedom is of utmost importance, and by individual, of course, they assumed men, because when we look at critical theory and feminist theory, one has to draw attention to the fact that when all these theorists who we will be encountering are philosophizing, they are assuming that it is man as the counterpart of the woman who is at the center of this philosophy, but we'll get into that later when we look at feminism. But for now, Adam Smith posits that the individual's freedom is of fundamental importance, that is the starting point of liberal theory, and under no circumstances must this freedom be fettered. Now, the primary opposition, the primary imprisoning of the individual freedom was the state, and liberalism is that theory which positions the individual against the state, wherein the state has to let go its control over the individual for the individual's pursuit of art, of commerce, of enterprise, of profit, and that is precisely what took place in Great Britain at the start of the early 17th century when the East India Company was formed in 1600. Now, why this is so extraordinary is the fact that we see a correlation between theory and practice. The East India Company was the world's first private organization, which means that its profits were purely its profits. It did not share them. It was not obliged to hand them over to the state, and the state that we're talking about, of course, is Great Britain. And therefore, liberalism is very clear about two things: the individual and his right to trade, and Great Britain profiteered from this liberal philosophy, which is also called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French phrase which means to let go of, to loosen the barriers, to allow the state, to set back the state, fundamentally limit the state. And of course, the historical context of this time is extremely different. States are mostly monarchies. Democracy does not exist. Democracy comes much later, in the 200 years later. So the context of this time is an absolute state which is overpowering, stifling, suffocating, powerful, and one which doesn't listen. And therefore liberal philosophy is extremely remarkable for having overcome the might of the state and championing the cause of the individual. And we have a long history of liberal philosophy. Following Adam Smith, there are two English philosophers, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and both of them argue that the state, the relationship with the state, is eventually a contract, which means that if either one party does not pay heed or does not follow or abide by the contract, that contract can be revoked. So at a time of divine justice, divine rule, where rulers and kings and queens followed the idea that they have a divine right to rule, which is unquestioned and unaccountable, certainly liberal philosophy made a powerful inroad, and most remarkably, the impact of this was quickly demonstrated in the wealth that Great Britain began accumulating. So we do know that the East India Company started off as a private company, and after its profits began to soar, It was acquired by the state, and which then took over the East India Company. We know that at the start of the paramountcy in India after the first war of independence in 1857, but that is a historical story which we do not have the time for at the moment. But the fundamental point that one must hold on to is that liberalism is a historical fight of the individual against the state for the sake of freedom, for the sake of his determination to pursue commerce, art, leisure, business, whatever it may be, and unfettered by the state. Liberalism is fundamentally posited upon the agency of the individual, and therefore, while liberalism began in the economic sphere, it quickly spilled into the political sphere. If I have the right to form a company, I must also have political rights, and by political rights we mean the rights and authority to shape rules political rules which impact the state, the rules and norms which can influence everyday rules which govern within an administration. And therefore, in the same state is where we see the earliest genesis of property-linked democracy is in 18th century Great Britain, and it is here when John Stuart Mill argues for the right to vote as a form of exercising control and participating in the state. So, liberalism succinctly focuses on the individual's right over his economic and political life, and values that, celebrates that in the form of democracy, and therefore democracy comes very organically to liberal philosophy, because democracy is that correlated theory within liberalism where individuals have the right to exercise power over the state, determine their future, determine the nature of their state, and therefore liberal democracy is a form of democracy where the state is shaped in every way by the principle that the individual is of foremost importance. Now, we've reached the 18th century, and the 18th century is of great importance because it is here that property-linked democracy emerges in Great Britain. The parliament is becoming more representative. Of course, we know of the Magna Carta in the 12th century, but from that point onwards, the parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons is beginning to be a more reflective body. And liberalism in every way is seen as a just way, as an egalitarian way. Of course, women were still not given the right to vote, but that's a different chapter. But it was seen as an egalitarian way between men, power shared between men in an egalitarian way. We also know that around this time there are two great revolutions, the American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789, and the American Revolution most certainly is bound by, fired by the idealism of this liberal philosophy, and which is precisely why, unlike the UK, which has an evolved constitution, as some would say an unwritten constitution, although parts of it are in a text and have been documented, but America very clearly celebrates that limitation of the state, and therefore the American Revolution of 1776 is again a celebration of individualism. So what one sees in this story so far is the idea that the individual is of key importance against the state and negotiates with the state, and the state has to let go, again the term laissez-faire, and not control the individual's speech, liberty, movement, and of course this is underpinned by trade and commerce. So what one sees is by the early 19th century, certain states have embraced liberal democracy. These states would be France, the UK, America, that's the United States, and they are upholding these values. And what is truly remarkable is that from divine rule, faith is posited in the constitution, which is a text. Now that itself is fairly extraordinary when you think about it, that from the head of a state who had complete power, you have now the faith lies in a text, in paper, and that is the constitution. And even and independent India similarly has placed its faith, its normative faith in the future of the state in a text, that is the constitution. Now that itself is fairly remarkable, but that shouldn't deter us from looking to the 19th century as a period where states are divided between democracies and monarchies. And it is here that things get extremely interesting because there is a certain clash of ideologies. And in order to link it later with Fukuyama, that there is an emerging clash between liberalism and other forms of government. Now let's just quickly fast forward to the First World War. And in the First World War, it is Germany, which is a monarchy. The king is Kaiser William II, who has absolute power. He is the head of the state as a monarch. And the First World War is largely seen as a cause of his sheer belligerence. And as a consequence, when the First World War breaks out, with the invasion of when Germany starts invading neutral states in Europe, is when the First World War breaks out. And by the end of the war, Germany is defeated. But there is this underlying idea that it was a monarchical absolute state which began the war. Now this idea is crucial to understanding liberalism. And this idea is crucial to understanding liberalism because it highlights the tension between liberalism and other ideologies. Liberalism is positioned on the freedom of the individual. Monarchism is certainly not, nor is dictatorship, and certainly not as communism. And liberalism has seen itself at war with these ideologies for the sake of the individual, for the sake of that autonomous imagined individual. And what is interesting is that the end of the First World War sees the first triumph of liberalism. And how is that? That is with Woodrow Wilson as an upholder of liberal values who celebrates the right of people to determine their future, the right of self-determination as that is called. And in 1919, when the fate of Europe is being decided, more specifically Germany is being decided, it is Woodrow Wilson who is the architect of that liberal institution called the League of Nations. Now there are three things about Woodrow Wilson that we must keep in mind before looking at what happens later. The first is that in 1919 there is a clear understanding that liberal states are good. Liberal states do not go to war, that is liberal democracies do not go to war. Liberal democracies are peace-loving states and would think twice before being belligerent, before being aggressive. And therefore, for world peace, for the to prevent the recurrence of a war, the easiest solution would be then to transform each state into a liberal democratic state. And that's exactly what took place at the end of the First World War, where Germany is demilitarized. Her king is sent off to exile to the Netherlands, but most importantly, Germany is declared to be a democratic state. Now, this kind of an idea is what liberalism is underpinned by. Liberalism celebrates the individual as well as, that is in political theory, but in international relations theory, liberalism is fueled by this hope, this optimism, this belief that liberal states do not go to war. This is called the democratic peace theory, positioned by a scholar called Michael Doyle. You could look him up. But most liberal scholars, most liberal philosophers have championed this idea in multiple ways. Now, how does one analyze this? One analyzes this by classifying this as an endogamous theory. Now, again, in the second lecture, we looked at this concept of endogamous, exogamous, and we can see it in practice now when we look at liberalism. And this idea is that the nature of the state determines its behavior towards other states, which means that if a state is a dictatorship, for example Mugabe's, or for instance Pinochet in Chile, that state would be aggressive and incite war, would provoke aggression, and would begin a battle, would begin war, would wage a war. On the other hand is the idea that democratic liberal states do not wage war, and for this historians have dug up data to look at instances of the very few instances, negligible instances of two democratic states going to war. So this idea, this normative idea that liberalism can prevent wars if liberalism spreads, is connected to the League of Nations, is connected to Woodrow Wilson, and is a clear example of endogamous theorizing, where the inside of a state determines the outside of the state. Of course, we know what the opposite is. The opposite is exogamous, where the outside determines the inside. And both this inside outside, we'll be looking at it in great detail during this course. But let's return to the League of Nations for now. The League of Nations is the first example of liberal institutionalism. Now, that's a crucial phrase in liberalism, and that is liberalism not championed by a state, but liberalism, an institution embedded in liberalism, by which one means that if we imagine an institution to be a building with a certain set of norms, actions and responsibilities, and a certain structure, that underpinning theory, it is embedded, and of course the word embedded means something which is rooted, the foundations, the very foundations of that construction, that building rather, are steeped in liberalism, which means that its objectives, its outlook, its goals, its aims correlate with liberalism, and that is the furthering of the philosophy of laissez-faire, which is of states withdrawing their control over trade and individuals. So, if this is slightly complicated, let's just look at it in a little simpler fashion, which is that liberalism so far was at the individual and at the state level. Individuals define themselves as liberal, states define themselves as liberal, but the League of Nations was the earliest example of that liberalism being put in a non-state actor, but one which would exercise great control in IR, and that is the League of Nations. The League of Nations was imagined to be that international organization which would prevent war by the philosophy of collective security, which meant that it would open diplomacy. There would no longer be secretive diplomacy. States would bandy with each other rather than against each other. And if a certain aggressive state did undertake war or disrupt international peace. The remaining states would then form a coalition against it, isolating it and thereby intimidating it and preventing it from taking on war. So the League of Nations is the clearest example of liberalism now being part of an institution, and it failed miserably. The League of Nations was unable to prevent the Second World War, and for valid reasons, and those reasons are elaborated in Carr's classic text, The 20-Year Crisis of 1929, where he argues that the end of the First World War was not a real peace, it was an enforced peace, which also meant that liberalism was forced upon states which were not truly accepting. And we can see that in the trajectory of Germany. Germany was defeated, humiliated, and democracy was imposed on it. And within about 13 years from 1919, that enforcement quickly unraveled, and we know that Adolf Hitler came to power using the democratic route and was a hugely popular leader, and it is then that he shed the democratic pretensions and assumed complete and absolute power within the state. So what we can see is that liberalism is marching along steadily, and it is certainly becoming a part of an international structure via an institution, and we see this in a full-throttled way at the end of the Second World War. Now, both the world wars see America's participation much after the war has begun. America participates in the First World War in 1917, a year before the war ends, and in many ways historians argue that America's role was pivotal to the Allied powers winning, and similarly it is in 1941 that America joins the Allied powers against the Axis powers, and the end of the Second World War marks the formal entry of America in shaping international politics, and it is here that liberalism is truly institutionalized in three pivotal organizations, and these are the World Bank, the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, and the third is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, which for 50 years languished as an agreement, but in 1995 was vitalized and activated into an international organization. Now, these three organizations are fascinating for institutionalizing liberalism by a victorious state, and that is America. Just as a reminder, America was not part of the League of Nations because even though Woodrow Wilson conceptualized it, the Congress, the American Congress, refused to accede to the League of Nations. But things are different in 1944, and these negotiations for the post-war future take place much before the war is over, and that is in 1944. So the war ends in 1945, but in 1944, much before the ending of the war, at Bretton Woods, which is in America, negotiations for the future are already being planned, ideas are being sowed, and these ideas are completely liberal and institutionalized in every which way. Now, what are these institutions and why are they important? They are important because each one of them is an international economic institution of huge importance, especially for recovering economies. So the war was damaging and impacted the economies of several countries. So these three organizations were set up as organizations to aid, especially the World Bank and the IMF, was seen as ways of aiding economies and helping them to on the path of development and building a stable economy. Also, there was the underpinning idea that states which have weak economies are more inclined to go to war than states which aren't. And of course, the historical experience or the historical example that was being drawn upon was the state of Germany, which where its economy had collapsed. The value of the mark was very low, and of course there are those famous images of people sweeping the streets with currency notes off the mark because they were valueless. So the underpinning ideas of the Bretton Woods are three. So the formation and of these three institutions called the Bretton Woods institutions are important because they indicate the willingness of America to take on a global role and be a more active player in international politics, but from an economic point of view. Now, we must remember that liberalism and capitalism have had a long intertwined history. Each one feeds into the other, and in many ways, America's construction of these three organizations is rooted and linked to its own capitalistic ideals and objectives. What is important to note about these three institutions are that all three of them embody what is called neoliberalism, by which we mean that liberalism is no longer centered on the state but is now institutionalized. To give a small example of that, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which is a convenient phrase for IBRD, which stands for the International Bank for Recovery and Development of Collapsing Economies, came with a set of conditions. Membership to these organizations came with a set of liberal conditions, which were that if a state was to take a loan from either the World Bank or the IMF, this would imply that the state accepts the structural changes in its economy. In short, that if a state was to take money from either of these institutions, it would relax its control over the economy. So a state which controls its economy is often called a protectionist state. And what is it protecting? It's protecting its people, its economy from goods and consumables and forces beyond the border. So protectionism is often the opposite of laissez-faire, and laissez-faire is where the state is relaxed and lets go of those controlling mechanisms whereby trade is controlled. And therefore, the Bretton Woods institutions champions two elements of liberalism. The first is free trade and the second is democracy. Free trade is of course part of the liberal theory which we mentioned at the start of the class with Adam Smith. And free trade means trade which is freed from the interventions of the state. So when the state doesn't control what is imported, what is exported, the rate of tariff, and tariff is that tax applied on incoming goods, is when trade is truly free. So free trade means freeing trade from the control of the state. And when free trade and democracy are upheld as the new principles of this neoliberal economic order, one can also see how that is close to the liberal agenda. So, an agenda is something which one sets out to achieve with a clear objective. These institutions certainly had and have a liberal agenda, which is that they hope to link together the world in an international enmeshed web of trade and democracy, and in many ways they are following the precepts of Immanuel Kant and arguing that trade, when nations trade, the chances or possibility of war are lower. So, in many ways, the calculations that liberal theorists at this time, primarily Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye, who published a book in 1970 called Power and Interdependence, argued that trade and democracy are the two medicines which can cure the disease of war. And Keohane and Nye's book then becomes a key text of what we called neoliberalism. Right, so what we've seen so far is that liberalism has flowered as a individualistic philosophy in the 16th century, where it is seen as championing the rights of the individual against the absolute authority of the state. By the 18th century, liberalism has a clear corollary, political corollary with democracy, and liberal democracy then becomes the underpinning of prosperity. America and Great Britain, the Great Britain and America demonstrate as to how a nation can prosper by commerce, trade and enterprise, and it is not it is a link that has not gone unnoticed between the prosperity of these states and the economic structures that they have upheld. So, it is extremely natural for these states then to champion the spread of that magical medicine which has cured them of poverty and underdevelopment and has allowed them to prosper. And the Bretton Woods institutions therefore embody what is called as neoliberalism and conceptualized in Keohane and Nye's 1970 book, Power and Interdependence. Now, Keohane and Nye's book is a classic text of what is considered neoliberalism, and in this book the argument is made that liberalism is that philosophy, that theory that can truly transform the world for collective better, and the magical mantra for that is trade. Now, trade is often seen as a win-win situation in calculations, where trade is one where there is mutual benefit, mutual prosperity, and also one which decreases the possibilities of war. So, Keohane and I argued that estrangement, states which do not trade with each other are more likely to go to war than those who do, and therefore drawing states into an international network of interdependence would be the cure for war and violence. And therefore, Keohane and I speak about interdependence as a way out, as mutual advantage, mutual benefit, and as a way of making sure that a third world war rather does not take place. Now, what is interesting is that it is during this period that the greatest opposition to liberalism comes from communist Russia. In 2019, the millennials and young students are often inclined to overlook the scale of power and authority and legitimacy that the USSR once enjoyed from 1945 to 1991 during the Cold War, the USSR posed an ideological opposition to the USA, as well as attracting allies from Cuba to India to other socialist inclined states. Hungary, China, a whole lot of states were inclined towards receiving funds from the USSR, being inspired by the USSR, and in following an alternative axis. So even while Kyohin and Nye are writing this, they're fully aware that there is an opposition to liberalism, and that is embodied by the USSR. The USSR institutionally did not join naturally any of the Bretton Woods institutions. It instead formed its own alternative institutions like the Comecon, which was an economic grouping of the Soviet inclined states. So in every which way, even while Kyohin and Nye are speaking about pushing liberalism, there remains a great dark void in a great dark obstacle in their path, and that of course is the communist states and socialist inclined states, states which are critical of the unabashed neoliberal principles of Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods, therefore, when it started out, was a double-edged dagger. On one hand, it promised goods, it promised resources, promised money, but at the same time, it came with conditions that states have to lower their tariff barriers in order to access these funds and these monies. And naturally, the states first to ask for loans or to take financial assistance were poor developing states. Now, that's a very interesting and complex area as to how post-colonial states, developing states were looped into this network of neoliberalism by the sheer lure of it. So what one sees is that during the 1970s, the 1980s and 1990s, poor states keen to take on social projects. For example, the Narmada dam was built on funds from the World Bank, and there are scores of examples of developing states taking loans from the World Bank and the IMF, but in exchange it came with a loss of control over the economy. Now, while this is celebrated within neoliberalism and liberalism rather, it does not quite have the same impact on states which haven't industrialized or haven't prospered yet. And as a consequence, consumer goods capitalist tentacles were allowed to penetrate into these economies much before they were equipped to deal with it. So there are studies as to how Nestle, which is the global consumer goods company, could sell its tins of powdered milk for young children. Nestle and other companies began making inroads into these economies precisely because they were facilitated by the Bretton Woods institutions. And there is a correlation between neoliberal policies and the debilitation of economies which are just setting out. So these were countries which had recently fought off colonization and were trying to stand on their own feet, and it is then that they were enmeshed in this neoliberal trap, one could call it, and which is why critics of neoliberalism often called the Bretton Woods institution an unholy trinity. So Richard Pete's book, which is a recommended book to understand the consequences of neoliberalism, is an excellent text to highlight as to the consequences of that neoliberalism. But having said that, let's stick to the track which is of neoliberal theory, Kyohen and Nye argued that interdependence is that magic mantra which could sort global issues out, and trade and democracy were one of them. And this fell into the trap of the democratic peace theory, which argues that democracies do not go to war with each other, but that also means that globally dictatorships are then identified as the source of power, as the source of unaccountable authority, and as evils which global politics must do away with. So, in the liberal point of view, there is a very clear good and bad. Democracies are good, dictatorships are bad, also because there is the liberal principle of upholding the individual's rights, the value of life, the quality of life are deeply imbricated within liberal philosophy. So, as the decades progressed, it became increasingly clear that liberalism and neoliberalism, the tentacles, the roots of these theories are truly becoming extremely deep, and that also brings us to the subsequent topic of globalization, which of course is a separate lecture possibly at the end of this course. But when we talk about boundaries becoming fuzzy, boundaries becoming meaningless, and there being a greater interchange of people, goods and trade across boundaries, it is important to remember that this has been manufactured by the Bretton Woods institutions with a clear agenda of capitalism, which also means that globalization as we know it today has occurred in spurts and has developed across time. But in the last since 1945, there has been a certain ideology and acceleration to it granted by the Bretton Woods institutions, which points to the ideological nature of globalization itself. The globalization which we see today facilitates some but not everybody, favors some but not everybody, and it is these hierarchies which are presented, which come to the forefront very clearly when one sees the neoliberal agenda of these three extremely powerful institutions as an indicator of its power and authority and influence. At the end of the Cold War, the USSR collapsed and there emerged Russia and 15 new republics, and Russia joined the WTO, which was formed in 1995, and subsequently so did China in 2001, thereby completing the universalization of neoliberalism. So, in short, of the 200 and odd states, about 190 are a part of WTO, the IMF and the World Bank, making them part of a global neoliberal economy which favors some and favors others, and we will be seeing that again when we look at the negotiations over the World Trade Organization, when we look at international organizations. But for the moment, what is important to remember is that when the USSR collapses, there is a reason that Fukuyama celebrates it. And the reason is that for the first time, there is no opposition to liberalism. For the first time, there is no ideological, territorial, theoretical opposition to liberalism, and the fact that both former communist states, Russia and a communist state but capitalistic within China, are part of these institutions, points to the fact that truly the world is indeed a is enmeshed in a neoliberal institutionalized world where the global economy itself is marked by a neoliberal structure. So just to recapitulate this long journey that we have made, we have looked at as to how liberalism started off by looking at the individual. It then transformed the state itself, because the state then limited its authority, and civil rights, civil liberties, constitutional rights are embodiments of liberal rights. The article from our fundamental rights under the Constitution of India are liberal rights which empower the individual against the state, that is within the state. But at the state's level, liberalism within IR transformed into a theory which believed, and again it's an endogamous theory, that the insides of a state can determine the outside of the state. Immanuel Kant argued that there can be a Pacific zone whereby states who are democratic will form a zone of peace, and that is precisely what we see taking place, that democratic states have allied themselves and formed a zone of peace, and violence lies beyond that. But of course that has changed dramatically with the formation of the World Trade Organization in 1995, and as an organization then, this gigantic organization, then undertaking the minute, tedious task of facilitating trade across the boundaries of over 190 states. So in many ways, liberalism has triumphed. Fukuyama is indeed accurate in saying that there is no opposition to liberalism, and it also points to the growing concerns of liberalism, and that is the individual. So human rights violations, genocide, the impunity of the state against the individual, there is certainly a liberal order emerging in international relations. We can see that clearly with the formation of the International Criminal Tribunal formed in 1998. Now this again is an extension of the liberal belief that the state has to be hauled up and cannot be unaccountable. The ICT, with its headquarters at The Hague, is the international body which criminalizes assaults and violation of human rights. It criminalizes genocide, it criminalizes violations of the rights of women and children, non-combatants, and it is truly remarkable in taking on this task of prosecuting and charging heads of state with violations of law, and reminding us that perhaps the boundary between the inside and the outside is now blurring. A dictator could previously exercise power, kill millions, and get away unscathed, but that is no longer the case. Before the formation of the ICT, there were two criminal tribunals set up on Yugoslavia and Rwanda, where prosecutions and trials took place against the heads of these states, against Milosevic of Yugoslavia and Mugabe of Rwanda. And in both these cases, one sees as to how the right of the individual across the boundary is of central importance, and in many ways this highlights that the liberal order is concerned with justice across boundaries and not just with justice within a certain state. The ICTY, the ICTR and the ICT are hallmarks of the understanding and the recognition that liberalism upholds human beings and the rights of humans across boundaries. And therefore, it is with that we return to Adam Smith and his celebration of the individual, and that is the crucial pillar of liberalism, that the rights of the individual cannot be violated. And we see that with the robbing of the impunity of dictators and the fact that there is now a global pressure on dictators and what they can get away with and what they cannot. And if one looks at the wide array of international organizations which follow this commitment to human rights, we see that there is the United Nations, the body of United Nations on human rights, on the rights of women, of children, of the disabled, a wide variety of rights which again uphold the individual against the state. So to summarize, liberalism has come a long way from in the last 500 years, from being a theory of the individual to being embodied in international institutions. Today, international economic institutions, from the World Trade Organization to the International Criminal Tribunal, embody that concern for the individual. And again, it tells us that eventually international relations is about people across borders, people within borders, and the meaningless of borders within this concern of the right of the human is far greater than the authority of the state. So we end this class here at this point. I've given you a wide range, a wide survey of what liberalism has been and what it is today, and in the subsequent class we will be looking at another theory of IR. Thank you.